So I'm starting with some problems I hope you might be able to share, shed some light on. Problems I encountered setting up the study and conducting it. I'll talk a little bit about the study itself and the role that semantics played in it, and a little bit about some of the analysis and the patterns I found, and then finish with solutions and conclusions. And the overarching problem I was investigating was feedback, giving feedback and trying to make feedback effective. And it's an issue I'm sure many of us are familiar with, spending a lot of time reading learners' work, thinking about how best to write comments. So investing a lot of time and energy, but it not always connecting, not always resulting in a lot of change. Perhaps due to students not understanding the comments, or if they do understand the comments, not knowing how to act on them, or only addressing surface features and not grasping sort of deeper conceptual issues. So this is sort of the big problem I was tackling and investigating. And I did this by looking more specifically at a particular context, which I'll tell you about in a moment. But really, I wanted to investigate how to provide feedback that is meaningful to learners, that meets their needs, but also helps achieve course aims. And these were sort of two opposing things that I identified quite early in the study that teachers were trying to balance and address in the classes. And I did this by taking a particular context to investigate. It was an Australian university, and I looked at English language pre-entry courses for international students. So these students had met all the other entry requirements, and it was just the English language requirement they needed to address. And they come and study for up to 30 weeks. So I looked at the middle 20 weeks. There were 18 students per class, and they studied intensively for 4 hours a day. And so the study is a contextualized study of writing feedback practices, looking at how teachers manage course objectives and learners' needs, those two things I was interested in, by varying the context dependence and the density of meaning of classroom discourse. So we can see immediately how semantics played an important role. And also looking at how teachers marshaled various semiotic resources as well. And if we have time, I'll briefly talk about that at the end. And it was important, and this will become clear in a moment, that important to me that I looked at the work and the classrooms of experienced teachers. So teachers who are not only familiar with this particular context, but had a lot of experience in other contexts as well. They'd been through training programs, and I really wanted to see how experienced teachers were managing feedback. So my overarching research question: how did teachers work towards achieving course goals while developing learners' language during feedback in writing lessons? And by looking at feedback, that often comes at the end of a sequence of work. So there have been some work around perhaps language, perhaps writing strategies. The learners go off and do some writing. Then there's the feedback. And so it's a useful vantage point. It provides a perspective on everything that has come before. So that was one of the reasons I chose it. So as a writing teacher, if you're interested in feedback, where can you go for advice to find out more? There is a body of research, going to the research, and it's called written corrective feedback. So written corrective feedback responds to the feedback on linguistic errors in learners' writing. And in this area, anyone who's familiar with it There is the written corrective feedback debate, which I'll briefly run through in a moment. And it just provides the starting point for my study. So this is, as a practicing teacher, I sort of engaged with this literature, and it goes back to 1996 when Truscott suggested abandoning grammar correction. He said there's no point, there's no evidence that this makes any difference. And for lots of reasons, we can expect it to be ineffective, and in fact, it's damaging. It's demotivating for students. Let's drop it. So that was the starting point. And then Theris responded to Truscott's initial claims and said, this is premature, this is overly strong, and listed a series of arguments against Truscott. And then the two of them, over the last 20 years have produced a series of papers. There have been many other research studies. And we end up with investigations into types of feedback. So if you look at this field, there are lots of studies that look at whether direct feedback is more or less effective than indirect corrective feedback. So direct feedback, this is when you give the students the correct form. Indirect feedback, you indicate there's an error, but you don't provide the correction. You can indicate and locate the error. You can just indicate that an error has taken place. You can use metalinguistic corrective feedback. There's also electronic feedback, so lots of different types. So this has become an important part of second language writing pedagogy. And if you study perhaps a postgraduate course in second language writing, you might read up in this area and study this area. And it's quite a useful academic exercise because you get to become familiar, students become familiar with the argument. In the tutorials, you can have the debate. You can set essay questions like, what is the written corrective feedback debate? And what's your position? And justify it with
Andrew,
the literature. Mm,
sorry, we've got a question from Susie.
mm.
Are the she hasn't got access to a mic at the moment. Are teachers on the course permanent staff at the institution? She asks, as in the UK on courses like this, pre-sessionals, they bus in a large number of teachers on a short-term contracts. And this has a major impact on being able to get a coherent and consistent approach to feedback, she says.
Yes, there are, for this, that's a great question, Susie. In this context, there were permanent members on the teaching staff. At this point, a certain percentage of the staff could be permanent, and then the rest were made up by casual teaching staff. And I think I'm right in saying the four teachers in this study were all casual staff members. And as with the UK, the numbers of students on these courses rise and fall as the start of the new semester comes closer. And so in Australia, in February, the main start date leading up to that point, the classes become very large and casual staff are brought on. And then at the second semester, there's sort of a smaller intake. And once all of those students, the successful ones that go on to start their degree programs, the courses then finish and slowly build up towards the next start of the semester. Um, an impact on getting a coherent and consistent approach to feedback. A lot of the casual staff are regular casual staff members who live in Brisbane. So certainly if someone is new to the course and to the institute, to the language teaching organization, um, it takes a while to become familiar. But again, the four teachers I'll talk about had all been at the institute and were established there and familiar with the course. Yeah. Um, so with this written corrective feedback, even in the literature, there were calls for situated research designs. recognizing the limitations of statistical research designs, and there were calls for contextualizing corrective feedback in second language writing pedagogy. So the trouble with the dichotomy of choosing one side of the debate or the other, picking a side and justifying it, while it's quite an interesting and engaging academic exercise, it doesn't help teachers give effective feedback. Um, and so these calls for more situated and contextualized studies, I thought sounded like a good idea and was the approach I took. Um, so then once deciding on that, there was the challenge of getting the study I wanted to do fit with the context I was interested in. So initially, I was interested in a longitudinal study following a group of students and teachers for a longer period of time. But on these courses, they change, all the students change classes and they change teacher every 10 weeks. Sometimes they change teachers every 5 weeks. And so I just couldn't, just wasn't possible to do that. So I developed a context-sensitive study, and by looking at a multiple case study. So rather than following one teacher over a longer period, I thought I could follow four teachers simultaneously and sort of stack it, if you like. So I followed two at a time. This then raised other questions about working with practicing teachers who are very busy and time poor, how to do this in an ethical and respectful way. And if anyone present has experience doing this or any advice to share, it'd be great to hear from you for a moment to see if anyone wants to say anything. Rob?
I can, yeah, I can share. There's a lot of similarities between our studies. Actually, I'm in the midst of writing up my PhD at the moment, as well, and I was looking at teachers doing course development, not feedback, but course development in an EAP context as well. Um, and Yeah, I think the one of the things in that kind of was the flexibility in my methods that I used. So there was one teacher who she wanted to participate, but she didn't want me to come in to observe the lessons. Whereas, and I had been doing that with all the other participants, and so we kind of negotiated that she would take a mic around with her and just record the lessons, that way, and then I could review it and then have that as a data source. And she did all the other bits, the kind of the interview, and she gave me her materials and stuff like that. But that sort of flexibility around methods, and also I think timing as well. I don't know if you found the issue of just timing, if you're doing interviews and stuff, trying to fit that around marking periods became very difficult to do that. Location of where you do it. Teachers in my study were kind of working across the university on different campuses as well, so it really puts a lot of you really need to be sensitive to that you're fitting into their context rather than getting them to fit into your research context. Um, I did have a question actually about that, because you talked about context sensitive study, and I was just wondering how you were kind of defining context in this sense.
Well, I suppose in the study generally, I also drew on systemic functional linguistics, which sees context sort of a stratified model of context. So I started to see classrooms in terms of genres, curriculum genres, and pedagogic register. So I might talk about that a bit later, maybe, Rob. Yeah.
Okay. All right, thanks.
Thank you for your comments. So I took a similar approach, and so a lot of these teachers, for them, observation is a form of assessment. If you do a pre-service course or an in-service course, or as quality control. So for some language teachers, it's quite daunting having that they don't relish the thought of someone coming in to watch them. So I again gave them, like you did, Rob, the digital recorders and said, if ever you want to, if you're not comfortable with what's happening, you can turn the recorder off. And so it put them in control. The digital recorder was on a lanyard, so they could wear it around their neck or they could just put it on the desk. And whenever possible, I went in to observe the classes. But I was working in this context as well. So occasionally I was teaching and they were teaching. It just wasn't possible. So I worked with the audio recording. Sometimes I'd work the morning shift and then I'd have 15 minutes to get to their classrooms and then watch them and make notes. And that worked. But sometimes I just couldn't get in there. And I also wanted them to be focused on the lesson and the learners and not on me or the study. And so again, I tried to stay in the background and tried to be unobtrusive. And there were one or two occasions when the teachers said, "Oh, I had such a great lesson. You'd have been really interested, but I forgot to turn the recorder on," which was a bit disappointing because I didn't get the data. But it meant that they were focused on the students and the lesson, and the study was in the background and not in the forefront of their minds. And so, I was fine with that. So yeah, had to be a bit flexible too. Um, but didn't want to go in and change something, but really just wanted to try and describe and understand what these experienced teachers were doing. So following the work of Allwright and Bailey, and particularly Dick Allwright. Um, And so it meant I collected a lot of data. It might be similar to yours, Rob. So by context sensitive, I suppose it was not imposing and trying to, gather data from that particular context. So observing lessons, taking field notes, conducting interviews with teachers each time they taught, but also focus groups with the students, audio recordings of the lessons, which later became transcripts, and then teaching materials as well. And to understand the classroom discourse, you need to really be able to see the materials because often the teachers are referring to these or the students are referring to these. Something might be given to the students. The teacher then has adapted this onto a PowerPoint slide, which is projected onto the board. And then the teacher might then write on the whiteboard over the top of the slide. And then the student might take a photograph and then annotate that. So, pedagogic modalities became very important in the study as well. But it meant a lot of data and it meant a lot of complexity as the study went on. And I found semantics was a key to unlocking the complexity of this classroom data. And I first became aware of it in 2016. And then just as I was sort of developing the study, and the more I learnt about it, the more it sort of influenced what I was doing. So semantic gravity, degrees of context dependence of meaning, meanings either closely tied to their context or carrying more abstract meanings, and then semantic density, degree of condensation of meaning. And so I use this to analyze the classroom discourse. But I also used it in the methodology as well. So here you can see some of my field notes. There's a little diagram of the classroom and the teacher's movement around the class as they're giving individual feedback to students. And I wanted to start with classroom practices rather than starting with teachers' stated beliefs or opinions, starting with a questionnaire or a survey. I thought it was really important to actually go into the classroom and observe what they were doing. And then as soon as possible after the classroom, I'd listen to the recording again. So you can see on the left-hand side of the field notes here, I mapped what was happening so I could find it easily on the recording. So it's sort of an SG plus, if you like, approach. And then I'd listen to the recording and prepare interview questions. And we've got an example of this here, things I wanted to ask in the interview. again, it was tricky to manage because everyone was busy, but there was a meeting room I was able to book, and the language teaching organization was happy to sort of accommodate me. So when I listened to the recording and look back at my field notes, I'd prepare these questions and I'd prepare the audio recording. So anything interesting that happened, I'd either get the teaching material or I'd queue up the recording. And then in the interview, I'd be able to say, okay, this interesting thing happened and describe it and then play the recording or show them the material. And so again, it was sort of SG plus. And then as the interview with the teacher went on, I was able to work through my questions, and then we'd move away from the actual classroom and, if you like, sort of weaken semantic gravity. So there's a bit of semantic, wave happening in the interview as well. And it meant that there is a study by Crossrate and Mao which looks at how stated beliefs and practices don't match up. And so what the teachers were saying was important. It wasn't actually playing out. So this was a good way of actually starting with what was happening and then discussing it and then getting to the beliefs later. So
Andrew, can I ask a quick question
yes.
about that process?
Mm,
You mentioned picking up on things you found interesting,
mm.
and just wondering what was your criteria for interesting?
Well, again, with this is again why semantics was useful. Once I was familiar with semantic gravity and semantic density in my data, and I sort of came to it through the published research on semantic waves, and I started to recognize that in data I'd collected. And then when I was in the classroom, I started to notice the teachers doing it sort of in real time. So I'd be able to, obviously things happen quite quickly, but I could flag it as, okay, there's a change here in context dependence or the density of meaning, and I could indicate it, and then preparing for the interview, I could flag it. I didn't actually analyze it in great detail till it was transcribed later. And I wanted to interview the teachers as soon as possible after the lesson so that they could remember, what had happened. So typically the next day, whenever I could. So that would be one criteria of interesting. There's a change in semantic gravity here or semantic density, and I just make a little note in the field notes. And then I wouldn't use those terms with the teachers in the interview, but I'd say, okay, in this part of the lesson, this happened. Can you tell me about this?
Okay,
And
thanks.
you play the recording. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Okay. Oh, sorry. So we're going to look at a little bit of data from the classrooms now. We had four different teachers, all experienced, but they were all following the same syllabus. So we're going to look at some feedback they gave now. This was a writing task about education. The students had to outline the various similarities and differences between studying a language and studying mathematics. So we'll look at teacher A, Arthur. That's not his real name. And Arthur did his feedback like this. He's got here on the picture on the left is his mobile phone in camera mode. And then he put the writing underneath the camera and he filmed it. And he filmed himself giving the feedback. And then he took all the videos and he'd put them on a Padlet and put the student's name there. And then they could watch the video and they could see him correcting their work and talking about it in real time. This was before the classroom. And then in the classroom, he had a series of activities he worked through. And I'll just briefly run through them. He started off by reviewing the writing task with the students and talking about it. He then identified errors that were common across multiple students' writing. And there was this activity where he'd give them an incorrect sentence, and then in groups they'd have to work at correcting it, and then they'd hold up the whiteboard. We can see that in the photo here. And then he gave them praise. He identified good topic sentences in their writing and shared that with them. And then he had an example, a model essay, a well-written one, and he'd cut up the paragraphs and the students had to order it. And then he gave them a copy in the correct order, but it had some gaps. I think these were missing, um, cohesion um, markers, and they had to go through and fill that in. And then at the end of the lesson, once he'd worked through those 5 activities, he then returned the students their writing with his comments on, and he walked around the classroom and spoke to them all individually. That was Arthur. Teacher B, we'll call her Beverly. Again, we can see the writing there on the left with Beverly's comments and correction code on. She took a slightly different approach, this edit your own mistakes. And so the table, you can see it's at a slight angle. Part of what the students had to do was to look at their writing and identify mistakes and then put them into that table to analyze them and identify the most common errors. And she was encouraging students to self-edit. So a slightly different approach. But again, Beverly had a series of activities. She started by reviewing and checking language from the previous lesson. Then there was an activity on clauses and linking words, and she got the students to stand up, and they had to stand in the correct order according to the clause or the part of the clause they were holding. Then she returned the writing, and we had this analysis exercise, and then she asked them to rewrite the essay for homework. Teacher C, we'll call her Chrissy. She started by reviewing the writing task and discussing that. And then her focus again was on error correction, but she looked at spelling and then looked at correction of sentences. And then after those 3 activities, she returned the writing and she asked the students to do some work on a spelling bank. I'll show you what that looks like in a moment. Use the correction code. So in the photograph on the right, the top document is the students' writing with the feedback written on it. The teachers used a correction code and the students looking at that below in a table, deciphering what the teacher's feedback means, and she's got her book open as well. And then during this activity, Chrissy made her way around the classroom and spoke to all the students individually. So that spelling bank activity, the student had to identify, so a bit like the analysis of teacher B really, but just at word level. They had to identify the mistake and then write it correctly and then use a look, cover, write, check method to focus on the accuracy of their words. Teacher D, David, again, he returned the feedback, the writing with feedback, and he gave advice on how to check work. Here we've got a learner corpus called Just the Word, which he put up, showed them how to use. So he had a series of activities as well. So timetabled in, to the weekly syllabus was a feedback on writing lesson. But actually the format that took was really up to the teacher. It just had to spend at least a lesson giving students feedback on their writing. And so David gave praise. That's how he started off. Told them what they did well in terms of structure, paragraphing, discourse markers, gave examples. Then he went into body paragraph organization. The instructions on the right, he said, look at your essay, look at the body paragraph. What's the topic of each one? He wanted them to identify it. And then once they'd done that, he returned the writing with the correction code and comments, and he walked around the classroom and talked to the students individually. So the writing task was the same writing task, it was the same syllabus, but the 4 teachers approached it very differently for very different lessons. So when I had the classroom discourse, I had the classroom talk, I could then use LCT, and that provided me a way into the data. So a sort of a big picture overview of what was happening and then into a more or detailed understanding. Um, I'm just looking at the comment and Thomas's comment. Ah, good. Thomas, do you want to ask the question now? Are you...
Andrew, what comment?
Just in the chat.
It must be directly to you because it's not in the group chat.
Ah, maybe it's about analyzing the classroom discourse, and I'll get to that perhaps a bit later if you remind me. The teacher's approach to feedback. I think the teachers obviously talked together. This is Susie's question about what teachers were told about feedback. The lesson is quite open, so they aren't given materials. It's not terribly prescriptive, but I think the teachers talk together and share ideas and share materials. I did conduct um, a study in the UK, and the teachers there had similar practices. So I don't think it's just a local phenomenon. So when I started to look at the classroom talk, I developed these translation devices for semantic gravity. And from what the teachers were talking about, at its strongest, they were quoting from the learner's writing. SG plus, it was talked very much in terms of the writing task. And as it becomes weaker, perhaps explaining decisions and talking about strengths and weaknesses in more general terms. And then perhaps at its weakest, relating to language or learning or writing. And we'll look at some examples in a moment. So
But
that was semantic
Andrew,
gravity.
what's the point of the coding categories?
Just how when I was looking at the
So
classroom
these are just
talk,
the names you gave to them, like concrete,
yes,
specific, and general.
that's right. That's right.
Yeah, it's just like they're not the indicators, they're just the category names.
Yeah.
Okay. I ask that because sometimes what people do is they'll just effectively reword the concept and say that's an indicator. So it's not an indicator. This is not what you did, I think, but sometimes when people say, oh, weaker semantic gravity indicator, less context dependent, and that is not an indicator. That's just a synonym for, that's just a redescription of, of the concept. So you've
Yeah.
got like indicators there on the column of chapter feedback descriptors. Is that right?
Yeah, so I found with so this is classroom talk around the feedback.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what I found. They were either talking about, particular examples, um, quoting the student's work, or it was closely linked to the learner's writing, or it was more general, or it then becomes about, writing or language or learning more generally. And with semantic density again, SD minus minus, the feedback meaning sort of dependent on the learner's writing. So you wrote, nobody traveled by train in my hometown. With SD minus, review the work we completed on transport vocabulary last Tuesday. And then as we're moving up, you need to work on the accuracy of your written English, an example there. And then SD plus plus, I've got, when it's given a comment like good work or B plus, which needs sort of further explaining or unpacking. So you can see these applied to here to a semantic profile. And what I've tried to show here in this heuristic is that there was sort of a pattern along the middle, and then it would drop down and then wave up. So it's similar to the sort of bobbing described in Erica Martulio's work in Classroom Talk discussing ancient history texts. Sort of there's talk about the text and then dipping down into the text itself, and then some more discussion, then moving away. So here, this is sort of trying to identify the middle area, if you like. We're going to spend some time looking at your writing. What are the key words in the question? So that's discussing the essay question. Yes, hedging language, cautious. So claims need to be more careful, more cautious. So this is the 1, 2, 3, sort of in that middle area. So this is your topic sentence. And then stronger semantic gravity is when the teacher might say, quote directly from the student's writing they've produced. So learning both subject needs a logical thinking. Or students who study a language need to learn lots of vocabulary. So these are when the teacher's bringing in the learner's writing and using it in their classroom talk. And then weaker semantic gravity, things like, for example, the teacher says, when we use of, we tend to use it with the. So less related to the particular task. Anna Vera, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. This is super interesting. I'm curious, when you plotted these, did you try plotting them separately, semantic density and semantic gravity separately, or did you have them sort of conflated already from the start?
No, I did them separately, and found that because they didn't always follow this pattern. So there are some
Okay.
occasions when, so here in this pattern I'm showing it here, when there's SG plus, there's SD minus, and we've got the wave. But there were certain occasions, I've got an example in a moment, where a wave wasn't happening.
Okay.
So yeah, initially when I looked at the data, I looked at SG first and then I looked at SD, and most of the time they were changing together. And then there were occasions when they weren't changing, and I sort of had to scratch my head a bit. We had an LCTQ meeting. I went for a coffee with Jack Walton, and I said, this isn't a semantic wave.
Okay, that's really cool.
Mm.
And I wonder what yeah, well, if we look at those later, that would be really neat to see what's
We'll
going on
look at,
there too.
okay, yeah, that's coming up. So
I just
sort of
ask, can I just
Paul.
ask in the middle two layers, is there any strong reason to order them the way you did? Because I mean, they're basically, if you think on the plane, they're just two different routes around the planes. So is there any strong reason why SG minus SD plus is higher than SG plus SD minus rather than being equivalent?
Oh, that's because, think of them as separate. So one's running from very strong to very weak, and the other's running from very weak to very strong. Think of the two. SG and ST is running two different strengths. So, like you analyze them separately, Andrew. You analyze SG and SD, and then you're just displaying them on the same place.
Yeah, that's right.
So you should never analyze SG and SD together. You analyze them separately, and then you bring them together for the simplicity of visualization that then can show patterns potentially. And so it just goes like from strong to weaker and weaker to strong, rather than this, but this two, this two, this two, this two. It's more SG and SD, like minus, 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 plus, double plus, and double minus, minus, plus, double plus.
Is that clear,
But,
Paul?
but a minus plus versus a plus.
No, it's two. It's two
You could
continuous.
visualize them the other. You could visualize them the other way around, and it would just be valid, surely.
Yeah, but we always put SG strong, ST minus, ST weak at the bottom on the profile.
Is it just a convention?
But it's a convention that would change the pattern if what you're looking for is waves.
No. Well, so hang on a second. So on the y-axis, it's SG from weaker to stronger, and it's ST from stronger to weaker. It's not the twos. So it's just the same old usual semantic scale that we normally use.
And the different width here is sort of the amount of time the teacher spent talking about different things, but the sort of the generic pattern is sort of this pattern here I've tried to draw. So, examples from the learner's writing, and then talking about the writing, and then talking about writing and language learning. And then, like I said, it didn't always follow that pattern. One example was with the word significant. And a student had written, it's significant for students to study in a quiet place. And they were using significant as a synonym of important. And the teacher had picked up with this, and it was one of the sentences they had to correct together on the whiteboard. And then during feedback, the teacher then went in to sort of explain and examine and discuss significant. So what we've got here is a constellation. So we're separating out what the teacher said about the word significant and how they dealt with it, and it was quite complex, really. And I'm trying to sort of show it clearly here. So this constellation, all constellations are grouping of the practice that appears to have coherence from a particular point. And so for this teacher and for me understanding the classroom, this certainly did. And so the teacher sort of made this observation about significant, how it wasn't a direct synonym for important, and then went on to give some advice to students and broke up
Sorry, hang
significant
on,
into.
Andrew. Sorry. Can I just ask? Did you say that they said it wasn't a thing? It wasn't this meaning. There was something else.
They said earlier in the week in the classroom material, significant had been glossed as meaning important.
And it's not. Yeah. And they said, no,
It's
it's
not.
not.
It's
Brilliant. So
not.
what we
No.
would want to do perhaps for, like, I'm not saying you have to, but for constellation analysis, is we could show the rarefaction that's involved, because like it's not just condensation that occurs, it's the removal of meanings, which sometimes occurs. So it doesn't happen all the time. I've not seen it very often in teaching, but sometimes it is. Um, there's been a few occasions where I've had to say field does not mean the same. The word field does not mean the same as it does in SFL. So if I've been talking in an SFL context, I have to say this is not the meaning field, or physics education. This is not the meaning of field from physics, or because everybody seems to think they own the word that they're using. But there's an example of rarefaction, the opposite of condensation. And I was just thinking, what would we do? How would we visualize that? Because there would be a link, maybe with two lines through it or something, two little lines through it to say, oh, we've just removed that from the constellation, or, we've kind of like said no link to this. So that would be interesting,
I hadn't thought of that.
Hmm.
And going to Anavira's question, it wasn't a wave because when this experienced language teacher has been trained in what we call language grading, so deliberately using clear and simple language that the learners know about to slowly add and explain these different meanings sort of carefully. So it was so that's eventually I got to the bottom of why it wasn't playing out like the other analysis I'd done when once I'd done the SG analysis and then the semantic density analysis and married them up and it wasn't matching. It was sort of initially a bit of a panic moment. But I think what we have here is the teacher unpacking the meaning. So it's actually more like a tour across the semantic plane. So carefully adjusting the meaning. The teacher's using very simple language to ensure that all of the students can understand. They're at about sort of low to mid CEFR, sort of B2 level, so upper intermediate. So keeping them all with him in the explanation and slowly developing their understanding of this lexical item and very carefully building their knowledge. So that's what an example here. So this was occurring as well. It wasn't always the semantic wave pattern. Okay, I might crack on and say we looked earlier at the different types of written corrective feedback. And what we have here with the semantic wave and with this, adding meanings to the term significant, this all plays out in the classroom language, in the classroom talk. And I started to see the role of that in feedback, in giving feedback. So in the SLATE project, Shushi Dreyfus and others looked at the written corrective feedback literature and they identified these four different types depending on how the rationale and how explicit they are. So hand holding is when there's a clear rationale and they're very explicit about the correction. Carrying, no rationale, but explicit about the correction. And then bridging, there's a rationale, but it's not explicit. Base jumping, neither. And so when I started to think about this, I mentioned earlier I had read about David Rose's work, and Thomas's question was about appraisal. And I think that would be a very interesting thing to do, to look at classroom discourse and apply that. Talking to Shushi Dreyfus some years ago, she suggested exchange structure analysis, so moves and exchanges, part of the discourse semantic system of negotiation, and then later David Rose's work on pedagogic register analysis, and going back, many years to Sinclair and Coulthard's work on classroom discourse and initiation IRF patterns. So the F there being feedback, and here in David Rose's reading to learn work, we can see these learning cycles where the teacher can prepare as an optional move and then focus. The students complete the task and that's evaluated. The teacher can evaluate that, whether it's correct or not, and then elaborate. And I started to see that actually the writing the students were producing was the task. And if they're getting written corrective feedback on it, that's some sort of evaluation. They're either, in some cases, getting praise, but typically it's some sort of correction. And I started to see that these types of activities, the types of written corrective feedback, actually seem to map onto these tasks. So with the hand holding, when there's a very clear rationale, when it's very explicit, this is implying future work. The idea is not that the student just reads the written corrective feedback and stops there. It's actually setting them up for another task. And when the rationale is there, the task itself being the student writing, the evaluate being the feedback, giving praise, or you need to correct this or work on this. When there's a rationale, that's elaborating. And if it's explicit, it's preparing them or providing more support for them to have another go at the task. So rather than just marks on the page, it's really setting them up for future learning cycles. So I started to see that really feedback is a dynamic process, not just about returning a piece of paper with red marks on. With the base jumping, when there's no rationale, when it's not explicit, and Shushi Dreyfus and others make this point in the book, it's a risky strategy, and it's risky because the assumption is the learner can successfully complete the task without any rationale, without any explicit correction. And if you're a teacher doing that, it's because you know the learner and you think they've got it, and they just need the prompt and they'll be able to do it independently. So it's sort of just try the task again. I think you can do it. If you think they need more support, then you're going to take one of the other options, either give a rationale or be more explicit. And if they need more support again, the hand holding, you're going to have both and support them in that task. Interestingly, with the teachers I looked at, after they returned the work, they were always on hand to talk about it and discuss it. So a bit of a summary of what we've covered so far. With the feedback on writing, we could maybe break this up into working on the learning outcomes, what we're aiming for, what we want the students to be able to do and achieve at the end, but also what the learners are actually producing, what they're writing. And the teacher, the 4 teachers in the study gave praise, but also identified work for the students to do. Regarding the learning outcomes, we can see these are addressed in some of the classroom activities. So some of the classroom activities seem to foreground the learning outcomes. So for example, discussing the exam question, looking at model answers where we want the students to be, versus the error correction, looking at where the students sort of are. And then when they return the essay with the feedback, sort of linking the outcomes to the writing. So if I were to summarize what we've looked at so far, I'll sort of put it into a diagram like that. I'm going to talk a little bit about solutions to the problems identified earlier. So the first one, the whole debate or the Truscott's argument, to give or not to give feedback. Of course, in a sense, Truscott is right. Just writing things in red pen isn't going to have any effect. We really need to see it as a process and as a dynamic process. So this idea of written corrective feedback and having a sort of dichotomy and picking a side and then using that to inform your practice, I think rather than that, this study's suggesting that really we should see it as a learning cycle and a dynamic process. And so this study, using LCT and other things, begins to see feedback as a practice. Regarding the problem, if anyone's facing a similar sort of problem of making the study and the context sort of fit and work together, my particular study the problem developed, and the research question developed and changed as I engaged with the context and engaged with the literature. And I'm happy to talk more about that if anyone's interested. And with the data overload, I'd say if you're looking at classrooms and trying to understand them, this might be part and parcel of that sort of work. And I found that LCT and the ideas of LCT, particularly semantics, enabled me to get an overview of what was going on and enabled me to think about my methods. But it also then enabled a more detailed analysis, which helped me work through that complexity. So I started this talk with a question, as a catchy question, but I feel I should try and answer it. How does feedback work? I'd say it works through the careful management of meanings. So planned, but also responsive movements across the semantic plane. Often, in my case, a semantic wave, but not always. It's the careful varying of context dependence and density of meaning. And also careful managing of tenor, field, and mode. Um, so the idea that, do I have time to keep going? I know I've reached the hour, I think.
Bring it all together, Andrew.
I'll bring it all together. Okay.
There you go.
So
That sounded like you were doing that anyway.
I was doing that anyway. Yeah, I've got a couple of slides to click through quickly. So with tenor and interpersonal meanings, really that learning cycle, the moves and the exchanges, really drawing on that. When we're thinking about classroom activities and those ideational meanings and what the students are doing, those activities we looked at, as I mentioned, are either more foregrounding the syllabus or the course goals, or they're foregrounding the learners, the group needs or the individual needs of the learners. And the general pattern that I saw is that the teachers tended to start with the syllabus and then they'd move through to group needs and then the learners. And they always ended up by giving the individual their work back and talking to them. So that seemed to be a bit of a pattern there. And then with the mode, we saw the video feedback. And then one of Chrissy had audio feedback. So as she was correcting the work, the learners could play the audio file and she talked them through what she was doing. We have the written corrective feedback as well. And then in terms of the writing on the work that the teachers write, and then bringing that into the classroom, we've got language as reflection and language as action. And we sort of get a pattern that looks a little bit like this. So that feedback, whether it's written or audio or video, is delayed, it's language as reflection, and that's brought into the classroom and it becomes more immediate. And then the teacher talks to the students about it, becomes language as action. So the teacher is sort of crafting this teaching tool. So the marks on the page don't work in isolation, but they set up future interactions for learners. The meaning's negotiated through the classroom discourse, and the student performance is finally evaluated as the student has another go at working on the corrections or working on a later draft and submitting it again. So we sort of then had a pattern a little bit like this. All the work, prior to the student doing the writing, looking at example text, lots of explaining. So here, using Van Leeuwen's term, at the oracular text, the text that needs interpreting. And then the learner goes off and produces this work, and that's to be judged by the teacher, what I call a Minoic text. And so it sort of plays backwards and forwards in a process like this. So this interplay between interpretation and evaluation going on in the teaching and learning of writing. And then over time, it's sort of autonomy and independence in the learner is built up as the teacher guides them and then sends them off to work independently and then brings them back to the classroom to give them the feedback and to work again more closely, and then sets them up with another writing task, which eventually sends them off to work independently and then sort of brings them back. And over time, this cycle increases their knowledge and their ability to do it independently. So to conclude, there's a nice quote here from Mitchell. So I looked at a particular context, these 4 teachers over a period of time, but I think we can make theoretical generalizations that are valuable to comparable research contexts. And this theoretical generalization depends upon the adequacy of the underlying theory and the whole corpus of related knowledge. of which the case study is analyzed rather than the particular instance itself. And I would say having LCT as the underlying theory benefited my study and enabled me to do this. So that's it. There's a question to take away, or we can talk about it now. How can evidence show possibility and guide change? So based on the study I've done and the evidence, I know how I might answer that question, but I'd be interested to know how others might answer it.
Thanks, Andrew, for that. Really interesting. And if anybody has any, just jump in. If you have a comment or a question or whatever, please just unmute yourself and jump in.
Anna Vera said that's a useful quote. It's a great paper if you get a chance to read it. And I think Mitchell he has a comment saying he spent many years writing it and got lots of feedback. So it's one of those papers that I found really influential and useful. So if you have the chance, yeah, it's worth tracking down.
Andrew, that was so
Andrew, thanks so much for that. It's really, yeah, just really interesting. I guess I had one question. So would you be saying this is kind of then good practice for so experienced and what you're calling good teachers are doing this? So you would then be saying, so new teachers or novice teachers this would be the kind of feedback practices we should be thinking of inducting new teachers into, or getting them to pay attention to those particular kind of moves that the teacher's making. I guess I'm just, feedback is given, or it's now, it's kind of the sense of it's this almost this panacea, that if you get feedback right, then learning will happen better and that kind of thing. So but I guess what your study's showing is actually really how complex it is, and the kind of reasoning that a teacher has to, the kind of reasoning moves that the teacher makes, the judgment moves are quite complex. Sorry, it's not really a question, I guess, but
No, that's good,
just
Carol. I'd
commenting
agree with
on
what
the
you're saying.
complexity
Yes.
of it.
I think it is quite complex, and I think
that often we kind of say, so teachers should do this feedback, but I think what you've really uncovered is really the complexity of those kind of moves and the sort of professional judgment, I guess, and knowledge that a teacher would need in order to make those moves productively.
Yeah, I think so, Carol. And I'd fall short of sort of saying specifically these, particular activities should be adopted across the board, but rather certainly selecting appropriate so selecting the activity and then sequencing the activity, I think is really important. And that obviously might change depending on who the learners are and perhaps their age and the context and the outcomes. But those sort of more general questions, I think, would be important. And in terms of whether it's sort of video feedback or audio feedback or written feedback, the idea that there's another step. It's part of the next learning cycle. And all of, the experienced teachers I were in the study, all then were available, made themselves available to answer questions from the student. I think that's very important. And sometimes as you mentioned, that the feedback suggested as a save all, and it's not always. There are some studies which suggest that peer feedback and student feedback works, and therefore students should just rely on each other and sort of leave the teacher alone. And while I think learning can happen there, I think it's sort of more powerful if it's certainly what all the students I interviewed valued. And I think there's a reason for that. Penny.
Thank you so much. That was so wonderful to hear that variety of teaching approaches, feedback approaches. I thought the one stood out that was sort of providing a portfolio, the storing the past feedback in a Padlet seemed to me to sort of stand out from the other three, particularly if you're doing that nuclear diagram, the planet diagram, and you're supporting the student with that. I don't know if they would use their past feedbacks as well, but that seems to be an extra support for when the student's far away from the teacher.
Yes. And I mean, that's another important point. The feedback, the student has to read it and engage with it. So just having it there, if they never watch the video, then there's no benefit, obviously. And if they don't read the comments, there's no benefit. So it has to be seen as a process, and they have to be, as with negotiation, there's an exchange. It's an active exchange. Mm.
Well, if everyone's just cogitating now, I'm going to say thank you so much to Andrew, the silent clap of doom on Zoom. You can never hear it. Thanks, Andrew. Thanks for finishing up our season 2 of the Roundtable, and I hope to see all of you next year for more. And if you do want to do one, just let me know, please, because otherwise it doesn't happen if you're not wanting to do them. I also just want to say that you may not be aware of it, but they just had the first ever Latin American LCT conference, which is extremely exciting. And that I just want to tell people, because it arose from people that they just wanted to meet up. So it began with the LCT Mexico group, and then there was an LCT Brazil group, and then more people came together, like an Argentina group. And then they decided they just wanted to meet to discuss things. And then from that, it just snowballed into becoming a kind of conference for Latin American LCT. And they didn't allow themselves to be stopped by there being 2 different languages involved as well. So I just think that's amazing. And so, join in. That's what I'm saying. You are LCT in the community. So you can just make it happen. Thank you so much, Andrew. I hope to see you all next year. But also, get in touch with me if you want. And I will hope to chat to some of you soon. Thanks, everyone.